think there's a branching path of possibilities for why convergence occurs. Our main two branches will be differentiated by the existence of a god. Now, in this sense, we're not defining God based on any religion standard, but simply a will which is exerted on the universe in some way, consistent through all space-time. This means God could simply be the existence of a universal will inherent to the universe itself and implies no form, belief system, or anything of the sort. But I think it's better to start with the opposite case, which is a world without such a will, one bound only by the scientific laws of the observable world. This means that convergence has no greater meaning, but also in many cases implies the possibility of free will. Now we can look at actions as being bound by two stages. The first is the laws of the physical world. I cannot wish for a pencil I'm holding to be teleported across the room and have it be so. I can take it and throw it and achieve the same end result, but the means of doing so require me to follow the laws of physics. Secondly, an action is determined by the conditions and external factors acting upon it. If the pencil will make it across the room depends on its velocity, the acceleration of its release, the effects of gravity, air resistance, and many more factors. But knowing these conditions, I could solve for if the pencil will complete its journey across the room. With that in mind and limitation as our focus, we can break down non-God convergence into two more categories. Those which are limited by conditions, and those which are limited by the laws of physics. To clarify our distinctions, let's look at the pencil once more. Nothing about the physical world is limiting it from reaching a destination. With enough force, it could be shot into the atmosphere and escape Earth's gravity, and that would break no physical laws. But I could not throw it with enough velocity to do so, which is part of the conditions or situation which create the limiting factor we observe. Firstly, let's look at the latter case and see if convergence is created by conditional limitations or simply probability alone. Something I'm including in this category, but that is technically free from all of them, is that convergence may not actually exist. What Okabe and crew observed and called convergence could just be a correlation drawn from the random nature of the universe. All the terms and ideas that craft the science of the Steins Gate world are simply their observations. The divergence meter displays the value of their world line, but those values may not be inherent to the universe and could be the result of his own observations and calculations. He time leaps and demails many times in the Alpha world line, and Mayuri dies each time, so he learned to group these possibilities together and designate them as an attractor field with a point of convergence. But we don't have confirmation that he explored every single world line in the Alpha field. There could be many where Mayuri lives, or CERN never takes over the world, and he simply never got lucky enough to find himself in one. If the number of world lines is truly infinite, then that means the number of world lines included in the Alpha attractor field is also infinite. To explain this, we have to get into what infinity really is for a quick second. Infinity is not a number, but instead a collection of all numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. We know where to start and can count an infinite number of increments in an infinite number of time, a countable infinity. Now what if we include all real numbers, not just whole numbers? So simplified, if we try to count every decimal between 0 and 1, smallest to largest, where do we start? Obviously with a 0 and a decimal point and then more zeros and eventually a 1, but we can always add more zeros before we even add the 1. There's an infinite amount of numbers in just this tiny sliver of our larger number line. This is an uncountable infinity. We don't even know where to start. If you want a much more in-depth look at infinity, Vsauce's videos on the subject are a great place, and I'll link to those below. But we can apply this infinity to world lines. The amount of world lines is countably infinite, and the number of world lines between the alpha and beta fields is uncountably infinite. With this in mind, it's easy to assume that out of Okabe's exploration of the alpha attractor field, simple random chance placed him in those where Mayuri died, or the same for the destruction of the time machine or his death. Convergence doesn't exist, or probability may have merely played them for fools. But that's not a very satisfying answer, so let's move to some man-made manipulation of the conditions under infinity rather than allowing infinity to play God solo. If there really are an infinite number of world lines, then a similarly infinite number of them will lead to the same place. not just to convergence, but say subtle shifts which offer little discernible change. We even see this in Okabe's actions trying to push past 1% divergence. Many things remain the same, such as his relationships, their location, and so on, because the world is influenced by an absurd amount of factors. Mayuri's death via Rounders was the result of their demail, but also the result of CERN deciding to investigate, because CERN was studying time travel, because they had a certain mix of people who decided to do that, because they all had parents who met and had those children. And this because extends backwards into the infinite void of space-time. With the limited capacity of their travel compared to the limitless complexity of the world, it's clear to see why Okabe is unable to change the future so many times. The amount he can do in that short window simply doesn't have a chance to impact enough conditions of the world. Convergence may simply be the result of the inability to place consequences on the world around you in a meaningful way, and convergence may happen thousands of times a day across thousands of world lines in ways they never noticed, because it simply didn't affect them. This leads us to another definition which renders convergence meaningless, however. It's simply the effect of earlier causes now out of reach. However, with enough persistence in time, as with any problem, you can whittle away at the variables and isolate and test for the one which produces the desired outcome. They can't change CERN, but their own actions which led CERN to their doorstep. It's like adding another cause rather than manipulating the effects, one which diverts the undesirable outcome. There's also another flaw in this theory, which is that some events happen regardless of selective causes. Mayuri doesn't always have to die to Rounders, sometimes instead to simple accidents or health conditions. If this were the case, then she would have to die in some discernible pattern, not in any way at a certain time. One of the solutions is to meld both theories we've covered into one, and assume the possibility that the exact conditions of their world could inhibit Mayuri's death in an infinite number of ways due to an infinite number of causes. Okabe is working around some of the effects, but walking into others that are ever so slightly less prevalent in the infinity of world lines, essentially slightly less probable. Again, his actions in those few hours can't shift much, so it's possible they're in a cluster that just so happens to have the right setup for her death in a variety of ways. The same can be said for the helicopter attack or his death in 2025. This is like the butterfly effect taking place on a very micro scale. Well, there's certainly more to be said about these ideas. The more we meld them into one, the more it devolves into a circular logic invoking the law of truly large numbers. This law states that given a large enough sample size, unlikely events actually become quite likely. Littlewood's law defines a miracle as a 1 in a million event, a ratio often invoked for unlikely occurrences. But he went on to explain that if an event takes 1 second and we're aware enough to observe events for 8 hours a day, then we can expect a miracle once every 35 days. Upscaled to the entire world population, a 1 in a million event should be occurring much more than every single second. Littlewood's law is a great example of the law of truly large numbers. We often view probability in terms of the individual, where it tends to look more shocking, rather than on the whole, where it looks much less so. Applied to Steins gate and assuming infinite world lines, then we can look at these seemingly unlikely theories proposed here as likely enough in an infinite sample size. Even if Mayuri lives in 99% of the alpha world lines, 1% of infinity is still infinity. For every world line where she dies, there may be an endless number of which where she lives. This infinity-based methodology defies common sense and thus somewhat falls apart in a discussion which includes concrete details. So we'll move on to something quite different and get into those ideas limited by the laws of physics rather than governed by probability. To do so, we need to establish a basic understanding of general relativity, which is one of Einstein's greatest theories. I'll keep it short and sweet, just covering the basics we'll need and linking to more in-depth looks below. The first important fact to consider is the speed of light, 299,790,548 meters per second, or for simplicity's sake today, 300,000 kilometers per second. For perspective, at that speed, light can travel around the entire Earth over 7 times in a single second. But this speed is a constant regardless of the observer's inertial conditions. So to break this down, say you're standing still and I stand next to you facing the same direction and throw a ball. It moves the same speed relative to both of us. Now, if we replay this situation, but you run forward past me as I throw the ball, it'll move slower relative to you than it will for me. Light doesn't abide by this principle. Regardless of the observer's state, it maintains a speed of 300,000 kilometers per second. The solution to this is to consider space and time as one entity of sorts, space-time. This value, the speed of light, is maintained in space-time, meaning the product of both space and time must maintain the speed of light, not one or the other. Let's graph this out for a visual representation. I was going to go to pen and paper, but then I remembered, as a wise starfish once said, we have technology. So we're going to this nice online utility here. We have two axes here. One we're going to consider, which is the y-axis, the vertical one, as time, and the other, the horizontal or x-axis, as space. So we're going to be drawing two lines here to represent a travel through space-time. Our first line is going to be 5 units long in the y-axis. That is 5 units of time alone. Our next one is going to be 5 units long as well, but with 3 of those being in the dimension of time and 4 of them being in the dimension of space, which the hypotenuse of which, as a 3, 4, 5 triangle, will be a total length of 5. So these two lines have the same total length. Essentially, they have traveled the same amount of distance through space-time. However, one of them has experienced more time than the other. As you can see, it's longer along the axis of time, where this one diverts some of that time into the axis of space. And that's kind of what space-time does to maintain the speed of light. It diverts some of that either from time into space or from space into time to maintain that magic number of 300,000 kilometers per second. So this is a very rough, very basic representation of it, but it's a good one to get a feel for how space-time works to maintain that number. So in short, the faster an object moves through space, the slower it will experience time. This means that time travel forward is theoretically possible, as with the twin paradox. One twin leaves Earth in an advanced spaceship able to travel at insane speeds, while the other remains on Earth. The twin from space will return to Earth to find their sibling to be older than they are. This also means that if through some unlikely means we were able to travel faster than the speed of light, time travel backwards would be possible in order to maintain that magic number. But this is a pipe dream more than anything at our current stage of science. Now, besides the theoretical relevance, how is this applicable to Steins gate? Well, for any time machine to function within the laws of physics, it must be able to manipulate space-time, not simply time. This is also true given that if you maintained your absolute position in the universe, when you shifted through time you wouldn't be on Earth, but a point in space where the Earth was/would be, but wasn't at that moment, and you would simply die in the vacuum of space. What's important is that we've established to time travel, you must manipulate both time and space, so Okabe and crew have that capability. What if we consider their time travels then less through time with some space, and more through space with some time? This is where we branch into the idea of a multiverse. Now, most of the justifiable theories of a multiverse revolve around string theory, the currently most accepted resolution for the marriage of general relativity and quantum mechanics. I have a scientific background, but in no way did I ever come close to anything this in-depth, so I'll be keeping it very general here and linking below once again. One of the theories under the banner of string, which could facilitate our topic at hand, is the brane multiverse. A brane is an extended object of multiple dimensions, and for most normal people that doesn't mean much. But our observable universe would be an example of a brane. According to string theory, it has 10 physical dimensions and 1 dimension of time. The size of a brane is determined by the energy put into them, so if an immense amount of energy, say the Big Bang, happened to inject energy into them, they could grow to an immense size like that of a universe. And with the possibility of an extremely high number of spatial dimensions, there's the potential for an infinite number of universes across are contained within these branes, existing as close to each other as near millimeters apart. Now, we wouldn't perceive them due to how strings are proposed to behave on these branes, but they could exist right there nonetheless. So if we consider this, The time machines built in Steins Gate and the idea of world lines could actually be an act of hopping between these alternative universes to one which played out extremely similarly, but fits with the changes made by a D-mail or the effects of their time travels. But what if a universe with that possibility they sought didn't exist? We say an infinite number of universes, but that's not a guarantee, rather a statement that we could never say how many. It's possible that, based on the conditions imparted on these universes from their initial jolt of energy, only a select few gathered the exact right conditions to allow both Kurisu and Mayuri to live. Or put another way, in most of them, Okabe has the conditions to die in 2025. The points of convergence would be due to a simple lack of options in the multi-dimensional physical world, and that the machine couldn't create a new universe on its own. Thus, the correction that is convergence would be made, or rather observed based on the limited possibilities. It essentially becomes a question of compatibility. There are universes where Kurisu and Mayuri both live, but the conditions of theirs don't match most of them. So time travel becomes about going back in time to set those conditions properly to then jump to the universe that you would like to see. Another possibility with the same end result is that of universal inflation. This theory is facing more criticism due to its ability to constantly create new versions of itself to fit the gathered data and for not having any independent and empirical line of justification, but we'll discuss it lightly here since we're already overanalyzing a pseudoscience anime. Now this bubble theory deals with the true and false vacuums in space, the interaction of which creates an expanding bubble with very high energy. These have the potential to have created our universe, and thus others as well, if we assume that an original grand inflation didn't end universally at once, but instead in pockets. If the original expansion continues faster than these pockets, or bubbles of slower expansion, then inflation couldn't continue eternally, creating infinite universes. However, these universes are also thought to have their own laws of physics, which may differ from ours, so the odds of our case decrease a little bit here. But from here, the logic is mostly the same as with the brain multiverse, but the characters of Steins Gate aren't hopping through time alone, but through space-time to reach an alternative universe which fits the conditions they changed. This bubble theory, though, also may account for some of the inconsistencies in Steins Gate 0. These bubbles, each with their own universe inside, have the potential to collide into each other, perturbing the space-time of each other. The failed time leap that sent Okabe to 2036, or the earlier random leap which sent him back to the Alpha world line, may be instances of this disturbance, although the latter case was explained as time travel experimentation elsewhere. But the idea stands that these could be an explanation for the anomalies only Okabe is able to remember with his memories persisting through space-time. There's more ideas out there which may dive into multiverse theories of their own, especially under string theory, but most of our discussion on them will repeat what's already been covered here, so I'll leave further explanation of such topics to more qualified speakers. One more idea I'd like to cover related to science is a furtherance of general relativity. This one will be a simpler and quicker explanation. Now, due to some immensely impressive feats of intelligence and logic, gravity, firstly described by Newton as an instantaneous force, was later reasoned by Einstein as the result of our surroundings accelerating relative to us. He determined that it's not a force acting instantaneously, as nothing can act or move faster than light, but rather that it's the result of space-time being warped. So this is just one of the most common visual comparisons between the two. You can see with Newtonian space, it is that flat surface where everything converges in, gravity pulling everything inwards as a force. But with the Einstein model, you can see everything spins and warps around these massive bodies. So mass and energy has an effect on space-time. As you can see there, it's called flexible space-time. And then this GIF shows another comparison that is pretty well made. So you can see it's an apple dropping in both cases, but the Newtonian model shows it making a curved path through space-time. But with the Einstein model, you can see it is making a straight path through curved space-time, which is one of the important distinctions here. But basically what's important here is just showing that space-time can be bent, which will be an important detail for our discussion moving onwards. But if you want to learn more about this, again, I'll have a link to one of the very fantastic articles below that explains this much more in depth. But with this in mind, we can look at the bending of spacetime as possibly relevant to Steins gate. If world lines, an aspect of time, are affected by the same things that spacetime is, then maybe the events of convergence are the result of the bending of world lines to a common point, or a seemingly common point. The result of something in spacetime so grandiose in its consequences that the fabric of the universe around it is bent around its being. This is all conjecture on my part, taking very non-physical things and giving them implications on the physical world, but it's the only theory we've had today which could explain convergence as something more than chance, whether based on the laws of universe or probability. To further this, consider we don't just feel the effects of gravity, but also apply them as well, just at a level so low it's indiscernible. Maybe given the right conditions, we can alter our beings as so important to time that we warp the dimension of time around us, causing like world lines, those that extend through time in a cluster, to bend to those common points Okabe is forced to repeat. They don't become one, as they may not under gravity, but their courses are altered in extraordinarily similar ways. If we let go of time as an abstract concept and accept it as much more physical than we know, then this could be on track to a somewhat answer, albeit mostly rough conjecture. And I'm sure there's even more we could explore in relation to convergence in Steins gate. There's the theological implications we mentioned earlier, but there was so much interesting to say about the science we'll have to save those aspects for another video. There's also the fact that the Steins Gate 0 OP says exactly there is no God, so it might be a bit of a moot point. But let me know if you'd like to see that one with a like or a comment on this one. Although the anime itself plays very fast and loose with our current understanding of science, it does present some interesting food for thought, even if only in hazy possibilities. Plus, its exploration of the morality of science, something we covered in the original, is expanded upon even more in Zero with the introduction of an AI with thoughts and feelings, which becomes one of the factors of World War III. There's a lot to be said about the ethics of creating such an AI we could become attached to, grow to love, and one who mimics someone who's passed on. A lot to say if, for all the good it could do, if the bad is worth it, and it would make us really forcibly redefine what we say being human is, or at least consider it in a different light and look at ourselves in a weird way through this man-made creation. But I'm rambling about a topic that is definitely for another day. But anyway, I'd like to take this moment to get better at self-promotion and remind you of a few links I'll have below, including my Twitter. If you want to keep up with me on I can randomly talk about my personal life or what I'm watching level, I'll link that below. My Discord if you'd like to reach me directly or hang out and chat with us about anything from philosophy to just how you thought an anime looked. It's a great place for that linked down below, and I'll have my Patreon as well, where I'll start putting our supporters' names at the end of videos if you're one of those lovely people who wants to support us directly and help improve the content. And once we get enough, I'll be doing some Patreon-only events for those lovely future supporters as well. But I believe that's everything I need to cover in regards to links, so I'll have some more videos linked in the description related to Steins Gate and science, some more on screen right now, as well as that subscribe thing if you would like to subscribe for more anime content that covers history, science, and just general deepness of anime, philosophy, all of that in general. But anyway, I'll stop rambling, let you get back on with your day, and just say thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you again very soon.